Just about a year ago, I had to move out of my old neighborhood. It's not that there was something wrong with the house I was living in, but it was the environment that wasn't so great. When I first moved into that house, I remember the first thing my husband did was put on new locks on all the windows and doors. After a few months of staying there, we even installed guardrails outside the windows. My husband always warned me to check the peephole and never to open the door unless I really knew who was out there. The crime rate was really high in that area, and oftentimes we would hear about burglaries in the nearby stores and shops. I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son that I dearly love. Sending them off to school in the morning was even frightening. I would have my husband drop them off every day, and I would bring them back myself. After the first few months that I lived in that house, I was very afraid. And what made it worse was that I didn't know anyone around there. Soon I came to know the neighbors who lived right across the street from that house. They were a couple in their mid-30s and they seemed like decent people. They had invited my family over for dinner, and we all enjoyed their company. Mr. and Mrs. Collins was always very happy and cheerful. There wasn't an instance that I could remember that I saw a frown on their face. Oftentimes, I would open the door to Mrs. Collins, who would bring over cookies and cake she baked. The couple lived by themselves in that house. After some time, Mrs. Collins started coming over to my house very often. Sometimes she would come when the kids were at school, and sometimes she would wait it out to meet the kids before she went back home. I understood that perhaps the woman felt lonely, being by herself all day, so I was never rude to her, although I did not always appreciate her sudden visits. During this time, I started to notice something that I didn't really like. I would often see Mrs. Collins peeking out her curtains and watching me as I brought my kids back home. I had gotten my husband to build a fence around my front yard. The kids had started complaining about staying in the house all the time, so I thought if they had some space to play in the front yard, they'd like it. Sometimes I would see Mrs. Collins leaning over our fence and talking to my son or my daughter. When I asked my children why she was here and what she was saying to them, they always told me she had just came to say hi and she was being nice. I assumed I was just being suspicious about this kind, lonely woman for no reason. In truth, she was always nice and treated me and my family with lots of love and affection. I spoke to my husband about her, and he also felt I was being a little too harsh on the woman. He told me he thought they were a good family and I could go over there sometime and give company to Mrs. Collins. My son had a habit of playing with my cell phone. One day after I had brought him back home from school, he came into the kitchen and asked me if he could play with it. I was preparing dinner, and just through the corner of my eye I saw Mrs. Collins getting out on her porch and locking her door. She turned and looked right my way and was crossing the road. I gave the cell phone to my son and told him as long as he didn't call anyone or delete anything, he could use it. I called my daughter and told her to stay upstairs with her brother. I honestly didn't want the kids spending so much time with Mrs. Collins. I don't know what it was, but something about her bothered me. There was nothing I could explicitly say that she did, or something weird she said. It was just the vibe she gave off that I found abnormal. My husband told me I was crazy. Mrs. Collins was always caring and compassionate, and I too couldn't say anything other than that myself. As I had thought, in a few minutes I heard knocking on the door. It was Mrs. Collins. She had just come over to spend the evening before her husband would come back home. She helped me around the kitchen as she spoke. As the conversation progressed, I asked her if she ever thought of having children. That was the first time I saw her frown. She told me that it was her dream to have a child, but it was unfortunate that she was unable to conceive. I regretted bringing up the topic, and I tried to lighten the mood. I packed up some dinner for Mr. and Mrs. Collins and walked her back to her house that night. When I got back home, I called the kids down for dinner. They hurriedly swallowed their food and ran back upstairs. Around 8 at night, I realized the kids had been with my cell phone the whole time. I went upstairs to make sure they were in bed and found both my daughter and my son sleeping in their bedrooms. The cell phone was laying on my son's bed. I picked it up and browsed through it to make sure everything was how I had it. I noticed a few minor changes. The theme and the background was changed, and my son had given me a new ringtone. I decided to get into bed myself and rest until my husband would return home. As I lay in my bed, I fiddled with my phone and found that my son had taken some pictures. I couldn't help but smile at his cute face, and he made the funniest expressions and continuously snapped selfies. It was the last picture in the folder that made my heart start to pound. I couldn't believe it, and I thought my eyes were just playing tricks on me. It was a picture of my son sleeping on his bed, and I would have assumed my daughter had taken the picture, but in the left corner of the picture, it looked like a woman's face had been cut off from the snapshot. I looked closely and noticed a familiar earring. It was the earring of Mrs. Collins. I was terrified, and deep inside, all my suspicions became the reality for me. When my husband got home, I showed him the picture. He couldn't believe it himself. He shrugged it off and said, "So what if it was Mrs. Collins? Maybe she just wanted to spend some time with the kids." I tried to explain to him that I never saw her go upstairs. She sneaked into the house. After a long conversation, I was able to convince my husband that I felt we weren't safe in that house anymore, and although he didn't think it was because of Mrs. Collins, he agreed to look for a new place. We spent a big portion of our savings to move out of that house. Mr. and Mrs. Collins were really upset that we were moving out. They tried to convince us to stay, but I didn't let the words get to my husband. It's been about 2 weeks here, and so far things have been fine in the new house, and there isn't anything that I could say seems to be odd. Suddenly, there was a continuous, loud knock on the door. I opened the door and found my son sweating, jumping in anxiety. He stuttered and choked on his words and kept pointing towards the road. I tried to calm him down and hear out what he said. Mom, they took Kate in their car. They pulled her." I ran out the gate and barely saw a car speed down the road and turn around the curb. I called the police immediately and pulled out my own car. I tried to follow the vehicle, but I lost sight of it. My son told me he hadn't seen who were inside. The windows were shaded. He kicked the ball out of the fence, and Kate had gone to get it back. The car had stopped just a distance away. He saw Kate saying something to the person in the driver's seat before the car opened the door and pulled her away. My husband and I have gone to the authorities, but they haven't been any help. I've been on the hunt since that day. I want my daughter back. I don't know anything other than how the car looked. I wasn't able to note down the license plate number. I know it could have been anybody, but I have a strange feeling that the Collins are involved. It was true, that day she sneaked into my old house. She had been with the kids while they were sleeping. The next day, I decided to go to Mrs. Collins' house. I didn't know what I expected to find there, but I had to get rid of the suspicion. When I knocked on the door, I saw Mrs. Collins peer out the curtains. Her face broke out into a smile and she hurried to open the door. She came out and wrapped her arms around me. "I'm so glad you came to visit. You're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you." She told me she was expecting, and she couldn't wait to have the baby in her arms. Mrs. Collins had noticed that I was a bit upset, but I didn't tell her about my daughter. I tried to look through Mrs. Collins' house as best as I could, but it seemed empty. I felt a little ashamed for having doubted Mrs. Collins and coming to her house to spy on her. I let her be, and I never returned to that house again. It's been over a year since my daughter has been missing, but I haven't lost hope. I know I'll find her. At the Collins house, the couple were overjoyed to have their first child. They were making their little one's first food. Her husband told her, "Look how cute." Mr. Collins sat at the kitchen table as he read his newspaper and peeked at his dear one. Mrs. Collins sat down and tried to feed her baby. "Come on now, you know you need to eat every spoon of it. Open your mouth, here comes the airplane." Mr. and Mrs. Collins was especially excited these days. "I have a feeling the baby will talk soon. What do you think will be the first word?" The two playfully betted over if it would be Mama or Dada. Mr. Collins had realized Mrs. Collins had been crooning over and over while she fed the baby. Mama loves you, Mama's precious one. Sometimes she wasn't even subtle. Say Mama, come on now, say Mama. The next morning, the couple surrounded the child with numerous toys, and they noticed their child was making noises. Mrs. Collins took the bowl out of her child's mouth, and both the husband and wife went on babbling like chickens. Mama, Dada, say Mama, who's Daddy's baby? The child finally spoke out. What do you want from me? Let me go. Mrs. Collins' smile faded. She ran out the room, bursting in tears. Mr. Collins sighed, and with a heavy heart, he put the bowl where it was, shut the lights, and locked the nursery door. He found his wife crying on the sofa. It's okay, honey. Maybe the next one will say Mama first. Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon because you know it's interesting.